Thank you for joining us. Glad that you're here. Again, apologies for the delay, so let's just jump right in and go. My name is Tim Mather. Good morning. I am the former Chief Security Strategist for RSA. Previously to that, I was the CISO at Symantec for about 7 years. I've been doing information security for quite some time. I, of course, am one of the co-authors of Cloud Security and Privacy. And with me today are my two co-authors as well, Subra Kumaraswamy and Shahid Latif. So, Subra, would you like to introduce yourself real quick?
Good morning, everyone. Again, I apologize for the delay here. My name is Subra Kumaraswamy. I work for Sun Microsystems. I am a Senior Security Manager focusing on infrastructure security as well as identity and access management. I am joined here by my colleague, Shahid Latif.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shahid Latif. I'm a partner with KPMG in the Silicon Valley practice here in California. I specialize in information protection and business continuity, and I've been doing this for the last 23 years with the firm, having spent about 10 years in the United Kingdom practice in the London office, and the last 14 years here in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area. We are just about to put up the slides in a few minutes, but just bear with us while we bring up the slides, okay? Tim?
Okay, let's get going here then. Let's quickly start off with something that we're not going to discuss today. We are not going to discuss information security aspects that are not impacted by cloud computing. So in other words, then again, of course, we are focusing on cloud computing today, and specifically we're focusing on those aspects of information security and privacy that are impacted by cloud computing. What we're concerned about is where is it that risk has changed, either lessened perhaps or increased, probably more likely. So again, we're going to focus on cloud computing and security and privacy. We're not going to get into a lot of, I'll call them standard information security aspects. We're also focusing on the enterprise use of cloud computing. We're not looking at consumer uses of cloud computing. So that said, here's what we are going to discuss today. We're going to go through and look at infrastructure security, and we're going to look at that as far as what the providers, the cloud security providers, are themselves doing on behalf of their customers, and what impact that has to your traditional enterprise infrastructure security. Additionally, we're going to look at data security, identity and access management. We want to look at privacy considerations. How is it that privacy is impacted by cloud computing? Audit and compliance considerations. And then we're going to look at another form of SaaS, if you will, not software as a service, but security as a service. That is, information security delivered through the cloud. And then hopefully we'll have time. We do want to briefly discuss what is the impact that cloud computing has on the role of traditional corporate IT or enterprise IT, because there is definitely an impact there. And again, we'll try to get to that, and provided that we've got enough time. So the model that you're seeing here as far as components of information security, for those of you who are information security practitioners, this is nothing new. This is a standard way of looking at information security that we've used for several years. And what we're doing this morning is we're mirroring this traditional approach with what we're going to discuss about cloud computing and security aspects of it. So you should be familiar with this, for those of you at least, again, who are information security practitioners. I should also add that we hope to have time for questions this morning as well. And again, apologies for being late, and I hope that that doesn't get cut out. The first thing that we should talk about is that in spite of the hype around cloud computing, and yes, there's obviously a lot of that, it's hard to open up any technical magazine or journal these days without at least one article on cloud computing. I think we're all familiar with what that hype is. But in spite of that, cloud computing is, number one, not revolutionary. It is definitely evolutionary. And number two, is cloud computing is not about new technology. Cloud computing is using existing technology. Now, some of those technologies, such as virtualization, are newer than others, but there is nothing specifically unique to cloud computing as far as new technology is concerned. What cloud computing is a change in the business model, and it's all about shared resources. The promises of lower costs, which is what gets business unit leaders and CIOs excited about cloud computing, is driven by lower costs, and that is obtained only through shared services. Now again, what's evolutionary about that is that in previous business models, such as hosted computing, co-location facilities, or application service providers, ASPs, is that much of the infrastructure was shared, but not all of it. With cloud computing, essentially all of the infrastructure is shared. Now that depends a little bit upon what model you're using, but if there's anything that you take away from the business aspect of it, remember that it's all about shared resources, because that's what gives you the lower total cost of ownership. Now there are three delivery models for cloud computing that have generally been agreed upon by the community at this time. If you look at this as sort of a stack, if you will, and think about your OSI reference model, at the bottom of the stack we have infrastructure as a service. Think about Amazon's EC2 as an example here. This is where the infrastructure is provided, meaning at the network level, and an image, an Amazon, as an example, an Amazon machine image is provided to you to then use however you want. Now that machine image is dedicated to you, but it sits on, of course, virtualized infrastructure underneath, and of course all of that is shared. Next up, above that, we have platform as a service. Think here, for example, of Salesforce.com's Force.com or Google's App Engine, two examples there. And then at the top of the stack, if you will, we have applications or software as a service. A primary example here is Salesforce.com, and I say primary only because it's probably one of the best known examples of software as a service. Now what's important here is not only to keep in mind that you have these three different delivery models and they're sort of in a stack like this, if you will, but that the lower down the stack you go towards infrastructure as a service, the more operational flexibility you have, but the more security responsibility you have. As you move up the stack towards application or software as a service, then you have the least operational flexibility and the least direct control over security. So for those of you, again, who are information security practitioners, keep that in mind. So beyond the fact that the emphasis here, or the change really in cloud computing, is that resources are now shared, the major impact from an infrastructure security perspective is that trust boundaries have moved. For those of us who've been in enterprise information security for some time, we're used to traditional boundaries about what's internal, what's external, where our different environments are, whether they're development, production, etc. And the key point here, again, is that the trust boundaries that we've known and are used to have changed. They've not only changed from enterprise IT to cloud computing, they also changed from infrastructure as a service to PaaS or platform as a service, and to SaaS or software as a service. So they changed depending upon where you are in the stack, and to make matters even more confusing, they changed from provider to provider even at the same level of the stack. Two SaaS providers, for example, may in effect have different trust boundaries for you, the customer. So that's important to remember. The other fact here that I would call out is that unlike previous models of computing, with cloud computing, there are no longer any physical barriers to data, any physical separation between your data and other customers' data or other people's data. all separation of data now is logical, and that has some ramifications for audit and compliance, which Shahid will be discussing here as well. So where are we today and where do we need to be? Certainly, one of the issues that comes up with customers either using cloud computing now or looking into cloud computing is a need for greater transparency with regards to the cloud service provider, or CSP as we call them, in terms of what security capabilities are they actually providing and how do they assure you, the customer, that those services, those security services, are being provided in a satisfactory manner, and what is it that the customer might still be responsible for. So how, what, and how the CSP reports on those security services is certainly something that needs greater transparency. One other aspect that comes up here as well is that with cloud computing is that we now have an ever greater relationship, or interrelationship, I should say, between systems, services, and people. Identity management, which Subra will be discussing in just a few moments, is no longer just about people. It never really has been, but cloud computing really brings this home, is that for identity management, we now need to be thinking much more about not only people, but also systems and services and how we identify those as far as authentication and, even more difficultly, as far as authorization is concerned. When it comes to data security, if you as a potential user of cloud computing think that data security may act as a compensating control for you over what could be perceived of as weaker infrastructure security controls, well, unfortunately, that's not going to probably pan out for you. You're probably going to be disappointed as well. Now, let me put that statement in context and say that to say that you might be disappointed depends upon where you sit. For those of you who are coming at information security from a large enterprise background where you have considerably more resources, considerably more talented, skilled personnel to work with than perhaps many SMBs have, you're likely to be disappointed. However, for many SMBs who have limited resources as far as money and as far as skilled technical personnel for security, they're looking at cloud computing and probably thinking that it's quite a bit of an improvement as far as their ability to provide security for their data for their customers. But when it comes to data security, there are a number of problems here. One of them is regards to what data can you, a customer, actually get your hands on when it comes to monitoring, for example, and management of security. The cloud service provider, the CSP, is collecting quite a bit of data. The problem is that data is not limited to you. It is commingled with all of the other customers that they're hosting. And that means that for you as an individual customer to try to get access to that data is very difficult today. And frankly, most of the CSPs, probably all of them, although I hesitate to say all, but probably all of them, frankly, do not have the ability today to segregate out your data, your individual data, from other customers' data. Therefore, the CSP is not likely to share that data with you. Now, given the fact that your data is now in the cloud, or you're thinking of putting it in the cloud, and that data might be sensitive, and it's beyond your traditional infrastructure security that you're providing, the use of encryption becomes very important. Because, again, it's all about shared resources, and that means that your data is now not necessarily shared with other customers, or you hope it's not shared, but the question for you is, how do you keep it from being shared? Because, again, there is no physical separation between different data sets belonging to different customers. All data separation is now logical. So use of encryption becomes very important. That's good, but use of encryption in the cloud brings up some challenges. One of them is that while point-to-point use of encryption, such as SSL or TLS, for uploading or downloading your data to the cloud, that works just fine, but what about point-to-multi-point encryption for data in transit? That's a challenge. There are not many products, I'm only aware of one of them on the market today, that claims to do point-to-multi-point and the scalability of that product for large enterprises is questionable. That particular product claims that it can handle 25 nodes. Well, if you're using more than 25 nodes, which many large enterprises may very well be doing, that's simply not good enough. Your data at rest, you probably hope is encrypted, but the question is it really encrypted? Just because data is stored in the cloud does not necessarily mean that the cloud service providers are actually encrypting it on your behalf. It would be very much in your best interest to ensure that it is. And if that CSP is not encrypting your data, then you need to be doing that yourself. If your data is going to be processed in the cloud, then it's definitely not encrypted. Today, there is no capability to process data that is encrypted. For data to be processed, it must be decrypted, and then it can be re-encrypted once it has been processed, which begs the obvious question then of key management as far as cryptographic systems are concerned. Who handles the keys, and where are those keys stored? So this has been an issue previously as far as the ability of key management to scale for an enterprise, and again, the cloud just exacerbates that as far as the need for scale is concerned here. So key management becomes a significant issue. There are some other methods that have been advocated by various people for taking care of data as far as, shall we say, privacy is concerned. You hear talk of obfuscation, sometimes redaction, truncation. Those are the obvious ones that you hear that come up fairly often. Now, from my perspective, I'm going to say that those are frankly nonsense. Now, when I say that they're nonsense, that's not to say that those don't necessarily work. The problem is that there are no standards around obfuscation, redaction, or truncation. How do you know and how do you assure that the data is being masked to some proper level, whatever that proper level is? Again, the real issue here is that there are no standards around that. We obviously do have standards for encryption, and you should be well aware of those. Think of NIST and specifically FIPS 140-2 as an example. So I'm going to say, somewhat harshly, but those alternative methods that some people advocate are simply nonsense. You need to be looking at use of, I'll say, proper encryption instead. Now, data lineage is hard enough in an enterprise environment, but it becomes even harder in the cloud. Data lineage is then where does your data come from, how does it traverse your network as far as where it's stored, where it's processed, where it's reported out of, etc. Given the fact that most cloud service providers won't even acknowledge for you where your data is actually stored, let alone what system it's actually stored on, data lineage in cloud computing becomes extremely difficult to do. Related to that is data provenance, which means that you actually have the ability to prove that your data was processed correctly. Well, if you can't even do data lineage, then data provenance becomes very hard. And for those business cases where data provenance is important for certain calculations, scientific work, for example, then data provenance is basically a non-starter as far as being able to do that in the cloud, being able to assure that the data was correctly calculated. And finally, data remnants, ensuring that your data is actually gone from the cloud and that no one else can look at it, is quite a challenge. It's a challenge in an enterprise environment where about 20% of hard disks fail on an annual basis. So how do you assure that your data is actually being wiped cleanly and to the satisfaction of your auditors, for example, following NIST standards, so that your data, once you think you've pulled it down from the cloud, is in fact gone, that it is in fact securely deleted, and I mean deleted in a positive sense. So those are some of the issues to think about when it comes to data security. Now, on the future side, so to speak, there are some issues here that potentially are a boon to data security. One of them is IBM's announcement in July of last year that they have now been able to successfully do fully homomorphic encryption, which means that you theoretically have the ability to process data while it remains encrypted. Well, that's great. That is a huge step forward theoretically. There are some questions about that as far as the viability of being able to do that on a scalable basis. So while that is quite an achievement by IBM from a scientific, if you will, perspective, and good for them, kudos to IBM for actually accomplishing that, the fact is that today that is not yet a viable alternative. So something to look forward to, but it's not here today. And of course, large-scale multi-entity key management is a significant challenge. Now, there is some work going on that I'll discuss in our second webcast today with regards to improving key management, but right now I'm afraid I only have time to tell you that key management today is probably a significant weak point as far as cloud computing is concerned. So those are some thoughts about data security as well. And so now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Subra, who's going to talk about identity and access management.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning. My name is Subra Kumaraswamy. I'm with Sun Microsystems, co-author of this Cloud Security and Privacy in Enterprise Perspective. Today I'm going to be talking about the identity and access management aspect of cloud computing. If you recall, Tim mentioned that key management is a significant challenge in cloud. I believe identity and access management has similar impact in cloud from the point of adoption and from the point of security. So when I say from the point of adoption, customers who are looking to either migrate to cloud or augment cloud will be looking at identity and access management as an architecture, as a practice, and as a process. And Tim mentioned that the trust boundary has shifted. So when the trust boundary shifts from your enterprise to the cloud, the traditional network controls, such as firewalls, IDS, potentially IPS, they have less of a role, and you have to rely a lot more on the identity and access controls. That includes authentication, authorization, federation, and provisioning. Two things I would like to call out is provisioning and authentication. The very first thing as you plan for cloud adoption, the first issue that you'll think about is provisioning users, i.e. identities, as well as provisioning the profiles by which users can use the services. Today, what we see in the cloud is that most cloud providers offer a vanilla, a very standard offering, which may or may not meet your needs. Especially with provisioning, most customers end up customizing the adapters that connect to the cloud. Most customers end up customizing a process by which they provision the cloud. So that has an issue with respect to scaling your internal processes when it comes to provisioning access. And I would also urge you to think, when you think of provisioning, to look at both end user access as well as privileged user access. Tim talked about this a pyramid of cloud services, starting with SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. So as you go down the stack from the SaaS to IaaS, you got a lot more responsibility for all aspects, and that includes identity and access management. To take the example of strong authentication, today the strong authentication, such as two-factor authentication using token card, which is a one-time password, or a certificate-based smart card, those kind of options are not available unless you delegate the authentication back to your identity provider, which means that you have to be ready with the internet-facing identity service provider to support federation, such as SAML. The other aspect of here is the support for federation using standards such as SAML is sparse and mostly seen at the SaaS level. There are some PaaS providers who are supporting SAML version 2, and I've seen quite a bit of, in the SaaS enterprise type service providers supporting SAML version 1.2 and 2, but it's up to the customers to take advantage of that. and especially if you're looking to leverage strong authentication. The next thing is user profiles. Most of the times what we see is that the user profiles are very coarse, which means that you have only 2 user profiles, typically an administrator and a user. For a lot of the enterprises who have gone through enterprise role-based access control, you may be a little bit disappointed to map your internal enterprise controls, access controls, to cloud-based access controls that includes role-based access control. So what are the standards that are going to play a big role in cloud? I talked about authentication, federation, and provisioning, and authorization. Let's start with the federation, which is one of the things that will enhance security. Especially federation will help you with policy-based authentication, with strong authentication. We see that SAML will play a big role. Today there are SAML version 2 is a de facto federation standard. SPML for provisioning, which we see it's a little bit on an infancy stage, and it probably will take 1 or 2 years or more for most providers to support SPML. XACML is a authorization expression, policy expression language. We believe that XACML is not, even though it's widely used within enterprise, we don't see support for XACML from a cloud service provider perspective. And lastly, OAuth. OAuth is an open source authorization protocol by which service providers can talk to another service provider without disclosing credentials. I think we see a lot of potential for OAuth, and customers should leverage that. And also we see emerging identity as a service option for cloud customers. These are third-party service providers who act as identity provider for you, who act as a proxy, who act as a gateway so they can abstract a lot of complexity with protocols. So I think identity as a service is a good option for anyone who doesn't have a good identity provider infrastructure to support federation. Okay, moving on. So the next security management, again, Tim mentioned that there is a whole the pyramid model where you go down the infrastructure, you got a lot more controls. So this slide indicates the various activities you should be thinking about. Again, this is not a prescriptive way of saying that this is how you should do it, but anyone who's adapting cloud services and want to make sure that the security policies and management are applied in the cloud setting should have a matrix with activities that you are responsible for versus what the service provider is responsible for, and map that to the deployment model, whether it is IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS. It's very important for you to understand what activity you are responsible for. And a simple example would be if you're running a virtual machine in the cloud, you are responsible for configuration management, patch management, vulnerability management, and access control for privileged users. But we go up to the SaaS, a lot of these functions are absorbed by the cloud service provider. They actually manage the typical responsibility using their IT operations. So, but again, it's very important as you look at cloud providers to understand the roles and responsibilities of your IT organization versus providers. And similarly, the security monitoring, similar to the security management, you may want to understand what capabilities and features are available to you, whether it is a network monitoring or application level monitoring. Again, as you go up the stack, you have less of a control, and you rely a lot on provider to offer this through a dashboard. For example, Amazon EC2 has something called CloudWatch, which provides you with some visibility into the performance from a virtual machine perspective. But if you're looking for a broad network-based IDS that trying to mirror internal infrastructure, you may not have an option other than relying on cloud service provider to do that for you. So in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the privacy, but there is a follow-up webcast presentation where we're going to do a deep dive on identity and access management. So for those of you interested in the identity and access management cloud, you could definitely join the next webcast where we'll be going much, much deeper, discussing all aspects of the access management. Thank you.
Thank you, Subrat. So this is, since we're virtual, you don't know that we've now changed presenters, although I think my accent may give it away. My name is Shahid Latif. Just to remind you, I'm a partner with KPMG here in Silicon Valley. So I'm just going to talk a few minutes on privacy, trying to stick to our timetable, so I may be a little bit quicker than I usually would be in this topic. Tim has already mentioned to you the importance of data and some of the issues around encryption around data. But one thing to recognize with the cloud is data is no longer static. It's no longer going to be residing in one particular place all the time and for a long period of time. And so the issue of data and where data resides is central to some of the issues around privacy. The whole issue of data and where it resides and where it's stored and how does it get transacted significantly changes in its paradigm with cloud computing. The other important point to recognize is that data governance is weak. Encryption is not pervasive. I think Tim did a great overview of some of the issues and challenges around encryption, and so there are some exposures to some of the data that's out there. In fact, last night I had dinner with one of the leading cloud service providers, and he even acknowledged that regulated data should not be going through the cloud at this very present moment. Data remnants receives inadequate attention. What does that mean? Well, data still can be residing in your network. It could be on a cache. It could be anywhere in that cloud service provider's network. The hygiene, the cleanup is really important to make sure it doesn't reside there. IP aging is important. IP addresses can still reside if you don't do IP aging, for example. So one of the challenges that you'll face with the cloud is that cloud service providers themselves absolve themselves of privacy concerns. They say it's your data. You need to be responsible and accountable for it. So it's very important to understand the implications of where your data may be residing and some of the legislative aspects of it. One of the things that's probably no surprise to anybody on this call is that the legislation is quite detailed. In fact, I presented at a conference in London, and they just launched a book. A lawyer wrote a book on the global issues around data privacy and security. It was about probably 5 inches deep, or maybe even more. There are significant laws out there, and unfortunately they're inconsistent across different jurisdictions. There clearly needs to be a global standard here. There is also needs for specific requirements for auditing, AICPA and General Accepted Principles, or GAP, around privacy concerns as well. And I'll touch upon those in a few minutes in the next section. But just to summarize on privacy, the key issue with privacy is to understand where your data is, the controls around that data, and the use of that data. And in the cloud, you have to apply a very different approach to it. Working collaboratively with your cloud service provider, I think initially how much data you let go into the cloud will be up to you, but I would suggest that you think about the sensitiveness of that data and probably start with unstructured data that's not regulated by any type of regulation. And then as you get more experience, evolve them. As technology will improve over the years, encryption, as Tim mentioned, is going to improve, then it will give you the reasons for going to the cloud in a much more broader fashion. So what I'd like to do now is just turn a little bit over to another topic, audit and compliance, and talk about audit and compliance in some detail. Again, as Subra mentioned, we're doing a deeper dive, and I'll go into more detail in that section of the presentation. But for today, I just wanted to highlight a few things. I've had the luxury of working with some of the leading cloud service providers here in the West Coast. Just to mention a few, Salesforce.com, Microsoft, Yahoo, just to name a few, and Workday. So I have very, very close awareness of some of their issues. From an audit and compliance perspective, if you look at the traditional model of an application service provider, in today's world, a SAS 70 Type 2 is often a request from the auditor to that provider saying, well, since I'm outsourcing my controls and my environment to you, please provide me a SAS 70 Type 2 so my auditors can rely on your controls through the communication of that report. Unfortunately, my belief is, and I actually talked to other partners from other firms, and they're in agreement with me as well, the SAS 70 Type 2 is a very historical report. It looks back over a period of time. It talks about specific controls as if they've existed throughout, and it relies on a lineage issue that Tim was talking about. The data travels through a certain pattern, and it's always that way, and you can control and audit it. Unfortunately, the cloud is not like that. It's very dynamic, constantly changing. Data could be in different machines at different times. It is absolutely a shared environment, and so the concepts of the traditional auditing techniques may not apply as easily. So I believe that from an auditor's perspective, a Assassin Type 2 would not be adequate to give you the comfort that the controls you're asking for are there. The good news is I think straight away that the applications that you'll use maybe in the first generation of cloud may not be relevant to your SOX compliance, may not be relevant to some of your compliance needs, but one day it will. And so it's important at that point to understand how do I deal with my boundary that I no longer have responsibility for those controls, and who's going to look after them. The cloud service provider users need to define their control requirements. It's important that when you enter a discussion with a cloud service provider, you understand the implications of what controls they'll be responsible for and what you as a user will be responsible for. Recognize that if you use the most embedded solution, the software as a service solution, you're almost giving total technology stack to the cloud service provider. So it's very important to understand where those boundaries are and what your responsibilities are. Understanding the internal control monitoring process of your cloud service provider is equally important. Subra just touched very quickly on some of the issues around database monitoring, server monitoring, and network monitoring. It is really important to understand how does that compare to what you do today. Do I have the same level of granularity, or is it much more high level? Understand those requirements are very important to you because you may need to meet a certain requirement, either from your customer or because of regulation. So the main issue here is the assurance of compliance. How do I know that I'm complying with the policies and procedures that I've laid down within your organization and applying those standards to your cloud service provider? A large cloud service provider I'm working with right now has a concept of client care and spends a lot of time with their clients, educating them on their security positions and postures and how much investment they're truly making in this space. So the cloud service providers are really taking this seriously, but it's incumbent upon users of the cloud to really define their needs and make sure they're understood, make sure the tools that they need are there, so that you have a very, very structured strategy towards the cloud. Just a final topic I'll mention, and then I'll head over to Tim in a few minutes. The intercloud cross-CSP solutions will demand a more unified compliance framework. Right now, what I mean by unified compliance framework is the control standards, say, of one company versus another may be different. So if you start to have multiple cloud service providers, let's say you use Salesforce for CRM, Workday for HR, Google Apps for some of your email, well, the standards across all three may be slightly different. How do you unify those three to you? And so one of the beliefs I hope that will happen in the industry is that there'll be some unified compliance frameworks adopted by the cloud service providers that allow you to have a common framework of controls. As I mentioned earlier, the multi-tenancy and the volume of transactions and the demand on the CSP is huge. And so the compliance programs need to be more real-time, have greater coverage than traditional programs, and really the mentality of looking at client server operations or batch processing, those are of the 20th century. In the 21st century, with cloud computing, it's a much more rapid real-time assessment that needs to occur. So historical reporting, to my opinion, is no longer sufficient. So those are my last words on audit and compliance. If there are questions, please use the chat line and we can answer them on the fly as well. But what I'd like to do is now hand over to Tim, who's going to talk about security as a cloud.
Thank you, Shahid. And that would be security as a service delivered through the cloud, often abbreviated as SaaS, and not to be confused with software as a service, but security as a service. So a quick time check here for everyone. We're going to end this webcast at 50 after the hour, or 10 minutes before the next hour, and we want to save the last 10 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to ask questions. We're going to talk for about another 10 minutes only, and then we want to ensure that we have at least 10 minutes to address your questions. So please feel free to send us your questions via the chat time, and we do want to, like I say, make sure that we are attending to your questions. So security as a service. Now, what's different here is that what we've been talking about so far, and we should really take a step back and say that the comments that all three of us have made today are addressed primarily towards public clouds, not private clouds. Many of the issues that we talk about are also issues in a private cloud setting, but to some extent they are mitigated because of the fact that it is a closed environment. So we're talking primarily about public clouds today. We could get into public-private. We're going to make an assumption that you all are familiar with the difference between the two, so we won't get into that. But what we've been talking about so far are the security services or security capabilities as provided by the cloud service providers themselves for you, the prospective customers. But we also want to bring to your attention that there is also SaaS, or security as a service, which is designed to be security provided to you, the customer, by a dedicated cloud provider of security services. So this is somewhat different, a slightly different angle, if you will, than what we've been discussing as far as provider security. And the difference being that providers are in the business of providing cloud services. They're not necessarily security companies. But security as a service, these are security companies that are offering them their services through the cloud. Now, some of these services are quite mature and have been around for some time. Email filtering. Let's take Postini as an example. Postini was founded actually in 1999, so they've been around for a decade, and of course a couple of years ago they were acquired by Google. But my point in that is that to say that email filtering and web content filtering are quite mature. These are services that have been offered through the cloud for a number of years now. There are some newer offerings which are emerging or nascent, which are really picking up traction. E-discovery in the cloud is certainly something that we have seen grow fairly significantly in the recently in the last couple of years. And you have an emerging identity as a service that's being offered. Now, quite honestly, the identity as a service that's being offered today through the cloud is focused primarily on authentication to date. It hasn't really dealt with authorization. And for it to really be robust, of course, it's going to need to broaden its capabilities to also include authorization. But it is there. It is available today. And for the most part, again, it's focusing on authentication right now. Now, there are some issues here as far as, who is doing or why can't these SaaS providers sell their services to CSPs? And we'd certainly like to see that. But today, they're not really doing that. They're not really selling to CSPs. They're selling to individual enterprises. And today, none of these CSPs are offering security as a service as an integrated offering. And the only caveat I'll make to that and say is that Amazon Web Services has moved in the direction. For example, they do offer authentication as a service themselves now as an integrated service that they've partnered with someone, but from a customer perspective, it is an integrated service. But for the most part, the other cloud service providers are not offering security capabilities themselves. But look for that in the future. Going forward, I think that we'll certainly see some horizontal integration. You see quite a few pure-play SaaS providers themselves that will certainly broaden their offerings. I'm thinking that a number of companies that will expand beyond simply email and web content filtering and provide other services. And I think we'll see some vertical integration here as well, such as the direction that Amazon appears to be moving in, where the established cloud service providers themselves offer more integrated security offerings for their company. We're certainly looking for identity as a service to scale to help the cloud take off. Frankly, identity management and key management are two of the significant technologies that are holding back truly large-scale deployment of cloud offerings for their customers. As we talked about earlier, the complexity of key management today is just screaming for an offering. And in our next webcast, our deep dive, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail about what that statement means. But key management, again, it really doesn't even work in the enterprise today, let alone in the cloud. So we're really looking for some stuff there. But keep in mind then that when you hear the term SaaS, it can be confusing. You have both software as a service, but you have the term sometimes applied to security as a service as well. And when we talk about security as a service, again, what we mean then is that this is security delivered through the cloud. This is not necessarily established cloud service providers providing security for their customers. These are, in effect, pure-play security companies that are cloud-based. So I'm now going to turn it over to Shahid, and he's going to talk a little bit about the impact that the cloud has had on traditional corporate IT.
Thank you, Tim. So again, this is Shahid. Hopefully, again, the accent's clear to you. So I just want to talk a little bit about the impact that cloud could have on your organization, especially corporate IT. One of the key issues that you will have to deal with is the governance issue. I already have some of my clients already come up to me, and this is about a year ago, where they said certain number of my divisions at the business level are going directly to some of these cloud providers using a credit card and starting to provision certain resources because they find it, one, it's quicker, more efficient than going to the corporate IT, and even cheaper, a lot cheaper. So it's already happening today. But if cloud does evolve the way we all expect it to do, IT certainly will become consultants and business analysts to business and business analysts to the business units. So if you think about the traditional model today, you have an IT department, maybe whatever number of headcount, focused on operational concerns and managing the environment. If you start to outsource that to the cloud, there's no longer that need to have the operational skills, but more important, the operational skills are the analytical skills of what do we really need, how do we support the business, and suddenly the role of IT is going to transform. The delineation between responsibilities between the providers and customers is become more nebulous. As I said to you earlier in the presentation today, what are you responsible for as a user of the cloud, and what is your provider going to do? And it's really important to understand that. Cloud computing is likely to involve much more direct business unit interaction with cloud supervisors than previously. I'll give you an example. I went to a large OEM manufacturer of hardware. I won't mention who. And they said that we're struggling to sell our products to this new cloud phenomenon. I said, really? Who are you going to in selling this? Well, we're going to the CIO and the IT. And I said, really, I would not go there. I would go to the business units, the head of various business units, where the business demands and needs are much more clearly understood, where budget normally lies, and where nimbleness to get to market is driven. Believe it or not, this is a fairly large company. They recognize it, but they never thought that way. And this is a meeting I had about 6 months ago, and they've realized that, yeah, we need to change our focus. So it is already happening that business units themselves are taking much more of the limelight when it comes to maybe adopting the cloud. The relationship between the business units and corporate IT as time goes on will shift. The power or the responsibility of IT will start to get diluted, and it will start to embed itself in the various organization units, whether it's a business unit that's responsible for sales or whether it's a business unit responsible for finance. Even today, finance is taking a lot of the understanding and relating to IT and making decisions around what IT systems to use, and even having power users that can go in and configure those systems. In the cloud, that will become ever more apparent and will be there. The number of functions performed today by corporate IT departments will shift to CSPs if the adoption of the cloud continues the way it is. A good example that I can give you right now is email in the cloud. A lot of my clients are now realizing that instead of spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars per seat, I can do it for a fraction of that by going in the cloud. All of a sudden, if you're using Microsoft Exchange, you don't need a Microsoft Exchange license, or even professionals with that background, you can have the cloud do all that for you. So all of a sudden, the department, IT department, no longer needs to have a Microsoft Exchange function because that's going to be outsourced to the cloud. And that's just an example. Functions that are performed by corporate IT department will shift to those who are there as not necessarily practitioners, like building and operating, but more to analyzing and defining requirements and making them go through. So the skill sets will shift, and so the IT athlete will become much different in the cloud adoption than it is today. IT will become more of a commodity, and skills will become more standardized and automated as the cloud evolves. And I truly believe, and I've talked to a lot of fairly significant CTOs, and they all agree that if the cloud does get to the heights it could get to, there will be start to see a shift in the way IT is managed. What is really not known today is the impact the cloud will have on the big enterprises. A lot of the penetration right now is at the small managed level, small managed business level, and there the adoption is really picking up. But at the large enterprise level, it's not really at the adoption factor of the smaller companies. For cloud to really realize its full potential, it's got to be at the large enterprises. This ends my discussion on the impact on the cloud, but I want to end on some conclusions and summarize some of my colleagues' comments. I encourage you, we have about 10 minutes left now, and I'd encourage you to maybe use a chat line to answer some questions, but while we're waiting for those questions to come up, I'm just going to summarize some key messages we gave earlier in the presentation. First of all, infrastructure. Part of the customer's infrastructure moves beyond their control. Tim talked about the OSI stack, and he talked about the responsibility of controls, and the boundaries of trust is going to change. And so it'll go, if you, depending on the model you use, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, or platform as a service, your control will become less and less. At the top of the chain, SaaS, or software as a service, you have the least control. And so it's important to understand that as you adopt these cloud initiatives. That the provider infrastructure security may not be as robust as your own. Tim and Subra mentioned to you that identity management and data encryption and hygiene may not be done at the standards you're used to in your company. And so is that acceptable to you? Do you need to put pressure on the cloud service provider? Those are really important things to think about. Data security or data governance is significantly a very important issue in the cloud. But it's also one of those things where everyone all of a sudden thinks that the cloud is insecure and data is running everywhere and you can't control it. The key issue, in my belief, is education awareness. There are very smart people that are building these solutions, and it's very important to recognize that whilst data may be in transit and maybe in a encrypted format or may not be, it's important to understand where that data is going and where it's stored. But there are solutions that are there today and in the future that will give you the ability to do it. As I said before, I strongly recommend starting with unregulated, unclassified data, but as you get used to it and as you get comfortable with it, move up the ladder in terms of the structured data. It's really important to have a classification standard around data. The inventory of data is very hard to get. I've been asked many times by my client, how do you do this? I haven't met a company that knows exactly where all their data is. So one way to get around that is to create a policy around data classification. How sensitive is my data? How critical is that data? And from that perspective, you can then put protective measures against it. You know, when you think about it, if you look at that 100% of your data flow, there's probably only 5 to 10% that's really sensitive. The rest of it may not need to be encrypted, may not need to be that protected. It's just general chatter or just general transactions that are going that don't need to be protected. But do you really understand that? Do you really know where that's from? And the classifications policy is really needed to address those. Subra talked earlier about IAM, and right now, IAM, whilst is very prevalent out there, it's in the very traditional stovepipe on a company-by-company basis. It is very weak in terms of how it will authenticate, especially in a very point to multi-point environment. As Subra and Tim both mentioned, IAM now needs to deal with not just people, but files and objects, of which there's millions and millions of files. And so the volume of data that needs to be handled is quite significant. So it's important that that understanding how IAM can help is important, but recognize today that there's still a long way to go for those solutions to be truly effective. I wanted to end on this slide and then see if there are any questions that are coming up. And there's a lot of good things about the cloud. We've talked a lot about the security considerations, but if you notice throughout our discussion, there are always things that could be done to improve. But we've never said it's impossible or it's insecure. There are just solutions that are out there for you. But one of the reasons why the cloud is so out there and so popular is for a number of very, very simple reasons. Cost is number one. It is very cheap. I give the example again. I didn't give you the numbers, but maybe I will. Microsoft, I'll just use the example. It could be any. I just picked Microsoft as the most popular email system. It could be up to $500 a seat for an email license. If you go into the cloud, it could be as little as $5. If you multiply that out with an organization of 10,000 people, that is a significant saving per year, per annum, and over 5 years, a significant saving. And not to mention the fact that you have you've lost the cost of keeping people that need to manage your environment. The flexibility and scalability, you have a solution that's on demand. You pay as you go. You don't need to consume the resources and then stay with it. If you use it for 2 months, you can let it go. I believe in the platform as a service area. If you use it for system development, I've implemented IAM systems myself. It can take months to order a server. With this approach, you can order it overnight, use it, and when you're finished, return it. So there's a lot of scalability and flexibility that you can have. In today's economy, which is still a little bit buoyant, you don't want to be burdened with costs. The other good thing about this is the costs are all expensed. And so the concept of capitalize the large expense and then amortize them out disappears with the cloud because it's just a service that you can expense. And so the predictability is there, and at a low amount, your P&L will be less impacted, and your balance sheet would have a capital asset. And then speed. As I said, going to market quickly is one of the prime reasons. Most of the cloud providers talk about stickiness. They want you to be able to do business with them quickly, and if you want to end, they want to end quickly. And I believe Salesforce is one of the leading examples of that. They're very proud to have a customer experience that's really good. Whether you want to quickly join or quickly leave, they want you to feel comfortable that you can do either things. Those are the last things I wanted to say about the cloud. We're almost out of time. I'm just going to ask Tim, I don't know if there were any questions that came up on the cloud, on the chat or not.
Yes, one question that came up with regards to whether or not we have a feel for regulated data being put into the cloud. I would say that from what research that we have done for this book and continuing research on the cloud is we are not seeing companies putting regulated data into the cloud. Nobody really feels comfortable with that at the moment. As Shahid just mentioned, the cloud is very good for non-regulated, non-sensitive, and non-classified information. But we're not seeing that folks are comfortable with that. Shahid, obviously being an auditor here, and certainly we've heard the same from other auditors as well, is that there's simply not a comfort level with putting regulated data into the cloud. Now, we do know that there is at least one of the financial services regulators in the United States out of the 4 that is looking into regulatory aspects of the cloud or what they should do to regulate that. That is under consideration within their organization internally. We frankly have had some discussions with them about that as far as what constitutes cloud computing, what's not cloud computing, etc. But that information is not ready for release yet. The regulators appear to be trying to understand what cloud computing is and get their hands around that. And until the regulators issue such guidance, I don't think that regulated industries are going to feel comfortable putting regulated data into the cloud. I will just say real quick, though, that there is an example of classified data being put into a cloud, but that is effectively a private cloud. The Defense Information Systems Agency, DISA, which is an agency within the Department of Defense in the United States, DOD, make sure I establish those acronyms for you all, since I know that some folks have brought that up about establishing the acronyms. Anyway, DISA has established effectively a private cloud for the Department of Defense, and that environment is known as RACE, or the Rapid Access Computing Environment. And in the first quarter, later this first quarter in 2010, RACE will begin to accept classified data for various Department of Defense agencies. At the moment, it's unclassified only. But what's different is that is really a private cloud, or actually more specifically, it's a community cloud. It's open only to Department of Defense organizations. It is not open to the general public. But other than that one example, again, we're not aware of anyone who is, any organization, any entity out there that is putting regulated or classified data into the cloud.
There's just another question, Tim, that came up. I'll just read the question for those that may not see the chat line. It probably touches on something. This is Shahid talking. What do you do when, in response to a request for audit findings or certification, a CSP refuses anything but a SAS 70? That's a good point, because in today's world, the cloud is new. Believe it or not, there's some people even in the US today that haven't even heard of the cloud. So clearly, the different reporting requirements out there are also not that well understood, especially by some of the cloud providers. So what I would do is embark upon a relationship with your cloud service provider. Obviously, the bigger your relationship, probably the more to say you have with them. But I'm assuming by the nature of the question, you may not have that relationship. So what you have to do is adopt a number of things. First, an education exercise. As a cloud service provider, ask them, do you have ISO 27001 certified? If not, when do you expect to do that? You have to put pressure on them to do that. Give them a response. That, in a sense, can give you something back to the auditors. Hey, they're doing 27001. The scope of it covers my environment. It's another layer of compliance that just adds to comfort that there's protected measures out there. In terms of the exact reporting requirements, that's going to have to evolve. I would say because of the new nature of what this is, where possible, and if it's a very important, you have structured data there, I would encourage an on-site visit. I would ask them to fill in questionnaires. Right now, I'm working for a large network company where they have a very active vendor management program where any vendor that has to do business has to fill in a set of questionnaires. So you may have to go down that approach.
And this is Subra talking. There's a really good white paper from ENISA, E-N-I-S-A. It talks about using ISO 27001 and 27002 to assess the cloud security provider risk framework and be able to identify the risk from the 12 control sections. So I think that's a very good paper for anyone who's looking to anchor themselves to 27001 or 2 standard to assess and benchmark cloud service provider.
And again, that's ENISA, which is the European Network Information Security Agency, or ENISA. They have a very good paper out and would encourage you to take a look at that.
So one last remark, because I think we're out of time. I would like you all to encourage you to go and look at the book we wrote. Some of you asked about glossary terms, and I apologize we used some acronyms, but the book has a tremendous glossary at the back. It's available on Amazon.com as well as the O'Reilly website. Everyone who I've shared the book with has said this is a great book. It not only explains some of the topics we said today, but it actually gives a very good introduction to what is the cloud. It gives us specific examples of the cloud, and it talks about a lot of what we said today in a lot more detail. So I would very much encourage you, if possible, go out there and buy the book. It's not that expensive. I think we priced it very reasonably, and go out there and buy it. I think, Tim, unless there's any last words, we'd like to end the call. And thank you for your time today, and look forward to talking to some of you if you're going to go to the deep dive in the next 10-15 minutes. And
again, just apologies for the late start. We hope that you found this useful, and hope to talk to at least some of you in our deep dive call in just a moment. Thank you, and goodbye.